right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the VR Creator Club here on Banter. I'm with our special guest, Daniel Sisson. Today, he's going to be going over his journey in building a company, a VR company, in 2024. So, without any further ado, I'm turning it over to Daniel. Put your digital hands together.
Hey,
Thank you. Thank you.
woo! Yes, you
Yeah,
are.
excellent. I'm going to talk a little bit about creating an XR company. So I'll give you guys my super quick background, and then I want to make this less of a lecture and more interactive. I think a lot of people in Creator Club are either trying to make a game or make an experience, and are at least somewhat interested in thinking about the business aspects of XR and making a company and what about these investors and all that. And so I'm going to talk a lot about things, and most of it will be my opinions, but also backed up with my experience in creating a company. The good, the bad, the ugly, the happy, the sad, the ups, downs, lefts, and rights of being trying to make an XR company. So real quick on my background, my name is Daniel Sisson, and I've been in the technology industry for a long time. I lived in San Francisco and worked in the kind of more classic tech space for a while. And so software companies, B2B and B2C, held a wide variety of roles. And I'm a self-taught developer. I taught myself how to code, I
Oh,
don't know, a really long time ago, making websites and things like that.
oh,
And
jeez,
then a
Ethan.
number of years ago, I got really
Yep.
into making XR experiences. And the first time I made an XR experience and I put it into a headset and I was in that experience was this like epiphany moment for me. And I remember I was living in San Francisco, working in kind of classic tech, and I remember telling my wife, I don't care about that anymore. Like I love this XR stuff. This is the future. I'm all in on it.
Go.
And from that moment, I've been learning and building, and then I ended up creating a company, and I'll tell you guys a little bit about that in a second. And it's been challenging and exciting. There's been really cool moments, and there's also been really horrible moments, and we can talk all about that here. Before I dive in, I wanted to kind of get a quick read on you guys. Like this doesn't really need to be like a lecture where I'm lecturing at you. I'll tell you about my experience, but I'm also happy to work through it all with you guys and any questions you guys have. So we're not a huge group, so it doesn't need to be like a giant lecture. You guys can ask questions. You don't have to save them for the end. But real quick, there's about 8 of us here, maybe. And how many of you guys are actually like running a company or want to run a company? Let's start with actually how many of you guys are currently running some sort of XR company, whether it's like anything.
I don't think there's any of
Matt
us.
in the back, this guy right here. I don't.
Oh,
If I point at you, does it work? How do I get you to? How do I get you right here in the front? You are the one. There we go. If I point at you, very nice is running a company. I think if I point at you, how do I get it to like Matt? You know how to
Y-
make it like
If
actually
you
tell
just
you
kind of
people's
like,
username?
you kind of
Focus on
point
them
point
your
long enough.
just above
Point
the
at the
head.
head.
really just like, yeah,
Mm.
that's the best.
Yeah, Matt over here, Arkin. Very nice. Is anybody else running an XR company in any sort? Right here, E Studio Noon is running an XR company, and then does anybody want to start an XR company at some point in the nearish future?
Maybe.
There's like a
Thinking
mix.
about it,
There's a
considering it.
maybe over here and another maybe over there, or a yes.
Okay,
Excellent,
Della.
excellent. Okay, cool. So I'll tell you guys a little bit about like my experience in the journey. So for me, the the beginning of it was came from that I became an XR developer myself. So I downloaded Unity, I learned C Sharp, I started building experiences. And right away, I ended up learning how to build a multiplayer experience. And it was a massive pain in the ass. And I was like, building multiplayer is a massive pain in the ass. And yet it's also one of the most amazing parts of XR is being together with other people in virtual experiences. And yet it's also incredibly challenging. And coming from San Francisco and Silicon Valley, it was like, hey, let's somebody should start a startup about this. And so I did. And we created a startup. CyberHub is the name of the company. Foundry is the product that we've been working on for a while now. And the nucleus of the idea is let's make it easier for developers to build their own multiplayer games and apps. And there's a couple different ways you can solve that problem. And actually, Banter is one of them. A platform like this is, or VR chat or AltSpace in the past, or spatial.io. There's like, I don't know, 10 of them. There's a couple of business ones as well, Engage VR, Arthur. There's a handful of business platforms. But these types of platforms are one way to solve that problem. So they provide a platform, they provide the multiplayer, they provide the servers. There's a lot of built-in functionality. But as a developer myself, I chafed at these platforms because they also have a bunch of built-in limitations, as well as there is definitely some question marks around IP. Like if you build a really cool game in here, do you really own it? Like yes or no? And maybe it doesn't matter that much, but I think for some people it does matter. And for some experiences and for some things it does matter. And what's crazy right now is that there's not really a simple way for developers to go build their own multiplayer game or app super easily. Yes, Unity exists and you can go develop with Unity. And yes, there are some solutions like Normcore and Fishnet and Photon and things like that that handle real-time networking. But there's a lot more to the puzzle than just real-time networking and Unity development. There's also other parts of the back end. There's a lot of functionality. It's a big step jump to go from I'm a Unity VR generalist to I'm now making a multiplayer game. And that's a huge jump. And so these platforms offer like a baby step up, but with trade-offs. And so the nucleus of the idea of our startup was, can we provide the same benefits that these platforms offer without the trade-offs? And so create all of the software like an SDK software that is more approachable than Photon or Normcore or Fishnet that also provides the other bits and bobs of the backend, the servers, the friend network, the idea that you can have multiple things going on and have lobbies and all that and handle all that for developers so they can build. Honestly, like you could use CyberHub's Foundry product to rebuild Banter, the entire thing. You could build Banter with it. And so, in fact, some of the things that they have problems with right now, I'm like, I remember these problems. We solved this like 2.5 years ago. Like even the finger clipping through weird like this on your hand, like we solved that a while ago. And like that's stuff that you have to work on. And in an ideal world, somebody solves it once and it's out there for the world and we just use that. And coming from the traditional Silicon Valley, there's a lot of frameworks, there's a lot of tools, there's a lot of dev tools, and there's a ton of libraries. And it didn't make sense to me that game developers were consistently building stuff from scratch over and over and over again, the same shit. Like, why is Banter trying to solve this finger problem again? Like, why haven't we solved this once for everybody? And so that's kind of the nucleus of the idea. Over time, it had to evolve because we had to interact with the market. But I'll give you guys a little bit more background, and then I'm going to pause and ask a lot of make this more interactive. So starting the company, I knew that it was a large scale problem and that it had potential of being a large company. Unity is a really large company. Unreal is a large company. Even Photon, one of the companies that we would somewhat compete with, is a very large company. And so I was able to approach investors and say, there is potential right now for us to build a company that's, this big, but it does have potential to become a billion-dollar company. Is it going to happen? I don't know, but it has potential. And then that allows you to raise capital. And the first capital I raised was from some friends and family. And I don't have a ton of wealthy friends and family. My parents are decidedly middle class, but they had a little bit of money and they believed in me and they put a little bit in. We're talking, my dad put the first $10,000 in, and that was incredibly helpful to get started. And over time, I had some co-founders, and we got a little bit more friends and family. In total, we raised about 200,000 in friends and family income investment over the course of the 2 years that we've been in business so far. And then we got a VC, and I'm going to talk about that because VCs is a whole another piece of this puzzle, which is good, bad, ugly, and sad. In 2024, it's not great. So we're going to talk about that in just a second. But at the very beginning, we also got semi-lucky and we did a project with Dell, like the computer company. And it was a pretty large professional services project. And it provided some really really nice income. So I'm gonna even talk about that as well and give you guys some more details on that. And the professional services income allowed us to also further go without having to raise so much capital. And so that, like, in a nutshell, that was kind of some of my journey. Before we keep going, I can talk about lots of these different pieces, the journey along the way and things like that, but I want to also make sure that it's in line with where your guys' specific questions are and want to focus it in on things, because there's a lot of different pieces of this puzzle: raising friends and family, raising capital from venture capitalists and in more professional investors. There's also doing things with professional services. There's also pieces of the puzzle like co-founders, making sure you have the right ones, making sure that the fit of the team, remote versus working together, XR as a whole, the market, headsets. There's lots of different pieces of this puzzle. So before I keep going, I want to stop a little bit and figure out where the questions are and see where you guys want me to go a little further down the path.
Daniel,
Yes.
I think that some of the questions I've been having is working on funding. Um, After friends and family, when you run into like other investors, uh, I've always wondered what the nuance of that is, and having somebody invest in your company but also not gain total control of it. Like, what is the relationship between them having the ability to be like, I don't like that feature, you guys shouldn't work on that, where but also you running the company and being able to decide, no, we do need to work on that feature. So
Okay.
that's kind of one of the ideas that I've been having.
Okay. Does anybody else have, like, I can answer that, but does anybody else have specific questions around fundraising from friends and family, and maybe fundraising with professional investors? Don't be shy, guys. There's like 10 of us here. How
A
about, let
tried
me
and true
ask a different
method is
question.
just to
Let
like
me ask a
point at
different question.
somebody.
There was a few of you that are running a company already. I think Very Nice and another guy, I don't remember. How have you guys raised capital? Don't be shy.
Short answer is no.
Short answer is no. And
I
then,
did have a project back in 2017 that there was some capital coming from it, but it fell through.
yeah,
Other than that, I developed on my own. I was interested. You made it sound like you said, hey, the VC thing didn't go so great, and I am interested in you telling us more about that. So
yeah, we're gonna talk about the VCs for
yeah,
sure.
yeah,
Have strong
hopefully you do.
opinions.
Yep.
Studio Noon, you raised your hand, I think.
I was the one talking actually.
Oh, you were the one just now talking. It
Yep.
looked like Barry was talking. Very Nice. Did you say you raised capital?
I
I think
didn't
it's
say
not
that, but in the past I have, but not for
the
this
past
kind
two,
of a project.
not for this kind of project. And right now, are you funding it through like professional services?
No, I'm just self-funding. I'm
Self-funding.
72 years old and I've been doing this kind of stuff for a long time. So,
Hell yeah. This is, by the way, the ultimate way to run an XR company is to self-fund it and be fun and not really have to depend on it for your income. But for those of us that are, I'm assuming a decent amount of you are somewhere between the ages of 20 and 60 and are hoping to make income off of this as well. And so let me explain a little bit with friends and family and how we structured that and how we did that, and then also with the professional investors and the VCs and some of the goods and bads, ugly and sads, and all of it in between. Um, so the first thing about raising capital for any startup, whether XR or anything, is that you have to have an idea of, uh, not first and foremost, not all startups, not all companies even make sense for investors at all. And I've kind of come around in 2024 to the conclusion that most of us doing XR companies should probably not raise capital or not raise very much. And some of the reason there is that you the the in order to properly raise capital, you have to have not only a good idea, but you have to have investor interest, and they have to also think it's a good idea. and they tend to be a little hype focused. And so in 2016, 2019, even maybe 2020, 2021, even maybe, it was a little easier to raise capital from investors in XR. Especially COVID was a key moment. A lot of companies were looking at like what's going to happen next. People were at home. The Quest 2 came out. A lot of headsets were being sold. There was kind of a mini hype bubble, and it was reasonably easier at that point in time to raise capital and for the investors to think, hey, I'm going to put 100,000 into this guy's business, and there's a reasonable probability that it could turn into $1 billion. And so it was a little easier at that point in time. Right now in 2024, it's incredibly difficult. So I've been raising capital, talking to professional investors, and the metrics, so the amount that you have to show them, hey, look, this is our traction, this is the number of signups we have, this is the number of potential users, this is the number of customers we have, just any metric you can think of. It's like their benchmark for investability is about 4x what it would be for quite literally any startup. Like if you and I decided to make a sales startup, an enterprise sales startup right now, our metrics we would have to show to get $100,000 would be X. The moment we're doing an XR startup of any sort, they're skittish right now. And so your metrics you're going to have to show are 4X. And that automatically makes your life very difficult. Investors, there's a lot of them, but they are a finite source. There are so many investors, right, in the world. You can run around and talk to all of them, and you're at a 4x disadvantage versus guys that are starting just literally any startup, like any startup that's not XR, just kind of random business software, whatever. If you're doing an AI startup, it's like you only need to have half X, basically. And that's slowly not coming to true. That was true about a year ago. And over the course of the beginnings and middle of 2024, that's kind of starting to slow down a little bit too, because you can see like the chat GPT models have slowed down a little bit. No one's really come up with like the crazy $1 billion business ideas with the exception of chat GPT itself. A lot of the investors have invested in a bunch of AI startups, and now they're kind of like, let's see where this goes, and it might be slower. So uh, a lot of the investors will probably jump onto the next bandwagon, whatever the hell that's going to be. I don't know. And Apple, the Apple Vision Pro, gave us a tiny little boost for a half a second. It was like there was a lot of hope in, and I talked to a lot of other XR founders. And some of them who've raised capital, some of them who've raised more than me, some of them who've raised less than I have. And in total, we've raised 300,000, 200 from friends and family, and 100 from a VC. And I have XR founder friends who've raised 600,000 and or more. And some of them, I was in a conversation. I won't say who, obviously, but I was in a conversation with some founders, and they're like, "I don't know how I'm going to make payroll next month." And so there's a lot of startups that have raised a lot of capital, and it's difficult. They're going back to the investors to get the follow-on rounds, and it's not there. The follow-on round is not there, or it's taking a lot longer, or the investors saying like, well, maybe instead of giving you X amount of thousands, we'll give you half X the amount of thousands, and we're going to take more equity for that. And so it becomes difficult. And so there's a lot of founders in the space that are making difficult decisions right now. In some cases, they're downsizing their teams, or sometimes they're now looking to say, what else can I do here? So if you kind of think about an early stage startup, you have a handful of different options for capital at all. This is any startup, but you have a handful of options for capital. Investors, and in investors, you have your friends and family. Then you have professional investors. And within professional investors, you have kind of smaller angels, and then you have VCs, larger funds. You also have professional services as an option. You can always do work for clients and make money, and then try to take the profits and use the profits to fund yourself. Um, Self-funded is an option for some people, and that can be whether you've built up a massive nest egg of money. That can also be whether you're maybe semi-retired. It could be that your wife has a killer job. It could be there's a couple of different ways that could happen. And so that's obviously always an option as well. Trying to think if there's any other options. If you can manage to make the tiniest possible product and sell it and sell a hell of a lot of it and then stay in front of your development cycle, you could theoretically bootstrap through licenses as well. The problem with XR specifically around that option is that it's quite difficult. It's really difficult right now to build an XR startup, whether it's a VR or an AR startup, whether it's a game or whether it's an app or whether it's something else that is so small that people will, but that's so good that people will give you money, and there's enough of them that you can then make enough money to build the company off of your own profits exclusively from software sales. It's a little easier to do in traditional software and web dev and things like that. You can maybe build a very small product that has a good market that's willing to pay a lot of money for it. Game devs by default are not usually willing to pay a lot of money for things. Consumers are not usually willing to pay a lot of money for games. You're not going to be selling hundreds of copies of games or thousands of copies of games for hundreds of dollars each. We're talking about games that are for $4.99, $8.99, $20 at the most. But if it's $20, you have already spent 2 years of your life to get there, right? So back on that self-funding source, that you always also have an option of working a day job and then doing this on the side. So you're going to have a longer time horizon there, but that's an option as well. Any questions on funding sources before we kind of dive into maybe some of the nuances of VC? Yeah.
No, sorry, I don't yet. But sorry, ignore me. I'm interested in what you're saying, Owen.
Oh, no worries, no worries. So I'll talk a little bit about, Matt asked the question a little bit ago, which is how do you not lose control of the company to the investors? And so right off the bat, if you are a startup that can raise capital from investors, i.e., you have a potential for this to become a large company such that investors are willing to put money into it, then you have to value the startup high enough for it to be worth it for you in the long run. And when you're just starting a startup, it's a little it's a little uncomfortable, but you have to raise capital from friends and family or even business angels, and essentially your idea and whatever small amount of prototyping that you've done has to be worth somewhere between $1 and $2 million for it to be even worth it. So if you're starting off and you're raising some capital from your cousin, your brother, your dad, your uncle, and your buddy's rich uncle or whatever, and you're pitching these people, then they're going to give you capital. It's going to be checks that are $5,000, $10,000, $20,000 checks. And you're going to be negotiating with them and saying that the company is worth already, because that we've built some prototype, because I think I have a strong feeling about this and we're going to be successful and you believe in me, and because the market has potential to become a multi-million or billion-dollar company, this company, even right now at its very early stage, is worth $1 or $2 million. And that seems nuts, right? To say something like we're worth $1.5 million right now. And it's both simultaneously true and not true. Like at that point in time, your startup realistically is worth $0. Like if you don't do it, nothing happens, right? But the moment you inject the capital into the company, it's worth something because somebody has believed in you. But if they say, well, right now it's only worth 100,000, I'm going to give you $10,000, then they own 10% of your company, and that's way too high for them to own if the company has any sort of potential for $10,000 for the company later to be worth millions of dollars. The math will never add up. And you're going to need a lot of these $10,000 checks. So you just have to, by default, automatically, right off the bat, decide that you're worth $1 million. It's like that's the bare minimum. Any startup starting, any founder, entrepreneur starting any startup that has any potential to be worth, we're not talking about restaurants, okay? You want to get an investor to invest in a restaurant. That's a tried and true business model. You can figure that out, and you can have a financier, and maybe their $10,000 gets them more than a tiny percent of the company. But for a software company that has, or even, whether it's a video game or a software company, any sort of augmented reality, virtual reality, mixed reality company, the potential is always really high, but it's going to take you a sizable amount of capital and time to eventually build that startup. So you're going to need a lot of these $10,000 checks, or you're going to need some $100,000 checks. And so you have to by default value the startup from day one at $1 million. So when you raise your first $10,000 at $1 million, they've just purchased 1% of the company, basically, and you've lost nothing. You still own 99%. If you're the sole founder, you still own 99%. If you have a co-founder, then you have a split between you and him or her. And so that's step number one. If you are getting somehow, if you guys are lucky and you have either you're very good at pitching or you have rich friends and family, and you're raising $100,000 day one, then you can say, well, this is a lot more money to play with. This automatically improves my odds. Then the startup is now automatically worth $2 million, $3 million, something like that. But your like intro pay to play number of the valuation of your startup is always going to be somewhere in the ballpark of $1 to $5 million. If you drop that at Stanford and you have a killer prototype and blah, 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 then maybe you can go straight to the $5 million range. For most of us who are semi-normal people, then you're talking in the $1-2 million range. Matt Arkin, did that answer your question in terms of understanding like not giving away the company off the bat to investors?
Yeah, that was pretty good. That was one of the questions, one of the things that's like held me back a little bit. Like, how do you get money and not give it away? So
If it is investable in such a way that there's high potential, then it's about the valuation and setting the valuation correct. To be fair, there are other businesses that could make sense. So you could be building a XR studio. You could be building a community group like this one, and your potential for the valuation of the company may be lower. And so you may have to say, you know what, in reality, the company is probably maximally worth $500,000 or $250,000. And then you have to be a little more careful. It may be worth it to get $25,000 on a $250,000 valuation, and therefore, if my math is correct, it's 10% to the guy, and that may or may not be worth it. And so you have to think about like the potential um, long run of the business, how far it could go, how big it could get, how much money they're giving you now. And you kind of have to, no matter what, you always have to devalue a little bit the early investors. And so another way to think about it, and a lot of people struggle with this too, is that the early investors are probably not investing in your initial idea. There's a high probability that the early investors are investing in you specifically as a person, in your tenacity, in your belief, in your experience, and in how your vision of how this may progress, and the fact that you'll probably be some part of it as it continues along. Even the 100,000 we got from the VC, he's like, I don't care if you pivot because I'm investing in you. Like I believe that you'll figure something out here. And so that's often part of it too. So your earliest investors, unless you're getting just an absolute truckload of money from somebody who's a key person, your earliest investors are investing in you and in your ability to probably pull something off. And they should be reasonably hands off. Like they've given you money, but they don't end up with a lot of control of the business. Any questions on that?
Sorry, yeah.
Yeah.
So sorry, like when you approach a venture capitalist and you're asking for, an investment into the company, is it sheerly speculative as to what I think it's worth, my own company, to determine what percentage they acquire? So like I could literally just pluck a figure out of the sky, but they're obviously going to want me to justify it, right? And I guess that's where,
Yeah.
that's kind of I don't know, a bit of a cryptic playing field. It's like I
In the
guess it's how
earliest
well I
days,
am. Go on, sorry.
yeah, the best way to think about this is that in the earliest days of literally any startup, but again, we're not talking about opening a restaurant. There's a whole different set of rules. When we're talking about software specifically, there's and video games are in the software category. When we're talking about software startups, video game startups, in the you have to have like a baseline $1 million, or it's just not really worth it. Is part of the reasoning, because you're going to need a bunch of those checks. That number is not real. Like, but they get that too. Like that number is almost like an industry benchmark. Basically, a couple of smart dudes with some form of a prototype and an idea and a couple of people interested in it, by default, that's worth $1 million, or it's just not worth it. It's not worth it for anybody to play the game. And professional investors understand this. They understand that if they give you $20,000, but then they end up taking 40% of your company, they actually have killed the whole thing because they know that you'll need additional investors, and the other investors will not invest in you because there's not enough left to make it worth it.
I see.
And the other investors will also be like, well, this guy's a dumbass. Like you screwed up. You shouldn't have given away that much. And so basically there's benchmarks. Like the moment you're starting your startup, by default, it's worth $1 to $3 million, or the whole thing is not worth it. Now, again, you can raise capital. You can do professional services instead. You can bootstrap. There are other ways, but when we're specifically talking about investors, like these are the numbers that make sense. And it's possible that your first one or two investors, you give them a little bit of a deal. You might be like, look, I'm worth $1 million. Back to my dad. My dad was the very first person to put any money into the startup. He put $10,000 in, and at a $1 million valuation. So like the very first investor we got was my dad, $10,000 million valuation. That's 1%. So at that point in time, my dad owned 1% of the company, and me and my co-founders owned 99% of the company. And later, even the VC that put in 100,000, if I remember right, it was at a $1.5 million valuation. So they own 7% roughly of the company. And they don't have a lot of, they have no control. They don't own, we did it all on a safe note. That's another thing. Like Y Combinator has a safe note. It's published. It's an industry standard for early stage investments. Until you get much further along, you just use safe notes. And safe is a simple agreement for future equity, meaning that you've purchased it now and it will become true later. It's real. It's a real legal thing. It's a real investment, but it's not a taxable event for the investor. It puts cash into the business right now. And when we raise more cash later, if we're successful, they get their equity in that moment, at that point. So the only two things you have to negotiate with the investor is how much they're giving you and the valuation that you're agreeing to. So you're saying you're going to give me 10,000 at a $1 million post-money valuation, meaning 1%. And if they're saying I want, 20%, then don't take their money. Like, because they're actually not, whether it's your uncle, your dad, or whatever, don't take their money because you're gonna strangle the startup later, basically. And a real investor wouldn't do that. As far as your dad, you're hoping that your dad is basically saying, like, if you think about your first few checks, if it's from your dad, your rich uncle, your wife's cousin, or whatever, it's they're saying, hey, Mark, I've known you for 5 or 10 years, or in the case of your dad, I've known you your entire life. I believe in you. I'm giving you $10,000 because I believe in you. And so that's another thing too. I've been talking to another friend who's just now starting an XR startup around the Apple Vision Pro. And he was like, how do I raise this capital? And it's like, listen, you have to understand that your first few friends and family, they're investing in you. They're saying like, I've known you for a long time, or I'm your dad, and I love you and I believe in you, and here's $10,000. Try your hardest to make something work out of that. And that's it. And what do you owe them? You owe them that you're going to try as hard as you possibly can to be successful, both for yourself as well as for them. And the reality of most of the startups, though, is that they're not successful. And the reality of first-time founders is that most of them are not successful. Statistically speaking, second-time founders are actually more successful than first-time founders, even if they failed the first time, because you made some mistakes along the way that you're not going to make again. And it's important for you guys to know as well that investors are actually more likely to invest in a second-time founder, even if he failed the first time, because that they know that some other investor or your friends and family basically paid for your learnings and that their investment has a higher probability of succeeding. And this is American investors. When we talk about Europe, it's a little different. Their risk averseness there is much higher, and so European investors are less likely to invest in second time founders who have failed the first time. which is a problem for Europe in general, actually, because it's actually unintuitively, it's not the logical play. The American play is actually the more logical play. Um, and it also causes the founders, the European founders that raise capital from European investors to be very, very careful because it makes them feel like I only have one shot at this. And if I fuck it up, it's over. No one will ever give me money again. In fact, I've talked to a lot of European founders. They literally said that if we fuck it up, no one will ever give us money again. And that's crazy. You have to be willing to take a gamble here. You just have to and know that you might fail. And so that's the other piece of this is if you're raising capital from friends and family, make sure that they know that when they write the check, you're going to do everything you can to make a return on it. But this is a super high risk investment. Basically, they need to say, I've given you $10,000. I love you. Do your best. And I'll probably never see it again. Like that's not what anybody wants to happen, but they have to have that mentality going into it. As an example, my uncle, my dad was like, maybe your uncle's been telling me he might want to put money in, but I know my uncle couldn't afford to lose it. So even if he put $5,000 in, he couldn't afford to lose the $5,000. So I'm not going to take it. Even if he wanted to give it to me, I'm not going to take it. I don't think he's fully understanding the risk of what he's even signing up for with $5,000. Like I want to give him a 20x return, but if I don't, you can't be like handcuffed to the fact that your uncle gave you $5,000. That's not the right way to operate the business either. More questions on investors, friends and family, and VCs?
Daniel, I did want to let you know that we have about 12 minutes left, and then the event will be officially be over.
Sweet.
So
all right.
Just want to make sure we're cognizant of time.
Yeah, I'll give you guys you guys were asking some good questions, and I think the investor thing, not a lot of people talk about transparently, and I think that's a bummer because it would be so much more helpful if more people spoke about creating startups and raising capital, especially in VR, more candidly. And so some of the things I want to tell you guys that are just my opinions. If I were starting over and doing it again right now at this precise moment, if I were in your shoes and thinking about starting a VR startup, whether it's Matt or whether it's you, Mark, or eStudio Noon, maybe doing a new venture or something like that, how would I do it? So knowing everything I know now, and knowing the way that the market is, the larger VCs, I would just take them off the table. It's a lot of work to get the capital from them, and everything is essentially against you right now. And so the way to think about it is you're going to have a really difficult time selling them on, as much as we all may believe, you're going to have a difficult time selling them on that $1 billion opportunity that's 5 or 7 years out. They're not seeing it. And so you have to instead think about building a business, which will make the business a little bit smaller, okay, in its grandiosity, but make a business that fits within the install base right now, i.e., can I make a business that works with the exact amount of headsets that already exist in the market? So don't be thinking about building a business for the $1 billion opportunity on the horizon. Think about building a business for like, hey, there are currently millions of Quest users, Quest headset owners and users. There are quite a number of people who still own Valve Indexes and other PCVR headsets. There are businesses that are using VR. Don't think about the potential of how they could use it. Build a business right now in XR around what is happening today currently. And because you're going to struggle with the investors. So instead, you're going to have to rely a lot more heavily on your ability to bootstrap the thing, meaning can I make money right now today that will drive the business forward? And some of the money that you can make if you have any sort of reasonable skill set around VR dev or 3D modeling and design. And even if you don't, if you're really good at sales or project management, you can definitely do professional services. You can get clients and do gigs. And the talent is never really the problem. There are a lot of people that are really good at this kind of stuff. And a lot of them are working freelance or are willing to work on the side. And a lot of projects don't require full 40-hour per week dedicated staff. So you could land a project building a training simulation for whatever XYZ company. And again, that company maybe even is your uncle's brother's blah, blah, blah. But you can land a gig for XYZ company doing some sort of VR training simulation and bid it at enough that you can cover all your bases, pay all the contractors, and make a reasonable amount of money on top. And by reasonable, I mean anywhere from 25 to 50% margin. So the contractors can get paid handsomely, whatever they want. Some of your contractors will actually be quite expensive. You're going to need like probably a senior dev who's kind of expensive and really, really, really knows their shit. That guy might charge you anywhere from $100 to $200 an hour, $150 an hour, something like that. If you're lucky, you find a super really talented senior dev, or you yourself are one, and you can do it, for a lot cheaper. But generally speaking, a really, really good senior dev somewhere in that ballpark of 100 to 150 an hour. And a kind of more junior dev might charge. Again, you could get lucky. You could also speak Spanish and work with guys in Latin America. You could have friends that are willing to do it that are quite talented. There's other ways to keep your costs down on the contractors, and then the businesses are usually willing to pay a reasonable chunk of change. And so you might be able to do projects for 25 or 50 or 100 or $250,000 projects. And after everybody gets paid everything that they're owed, there could be anywhere from 25 to 50 or so percent margin. So on a 200K job, the business itself could net $100,000 in profit. Then that $100,000 funds your R&D and product development of what it is that you're making, or it funds even your game dev endeavors. You guys know Synth Riders? The game is kind of like Beat Saber / Pistol Whip. Some of these games, like the founder of the studio Synth Riders talked about this a lot too. He's like, if you can make really good games, and they make money off of Synth Riders, and every time that there's a kind of big push of headset sales, Quest 3 comes out, a bunch of Quest 3s are sold, they tend to make a bunch of money in the following months off of game sales. It's a good game. It's one of the higher rated games. It's more popular on the Quest platform. And so every time there's a big Quest bump of sales, they make a jump. So Christmas time, they probably do a decent amount of revenue in that. But he talked about how in the downtimes, they actually do professional services for businesses. They'll make VR training simulators and things like that on the side. Why? Because you have a team of people who have all the correct skill set, and it's an alternate stream of revenue that allows you to make additional revenue on the side and be a lot less dependent on the investors who are not super jazzed about our space right now. I think the investors are going to come around over the course of the next 5 years. But once you want to build it, I mean, that's another option too. Don't build an XR startup in 2024. Like, do something else and come back in a couple of years. But if you want to build one right now, my best advice is find some way to do professional services as well. Alternatively, if your day job is that you're, I don't know, let's just go with something really completely unrelated. Let's say you're like a content writer for a grocery store or something. You write you write Trader Joe's weekly newsletter or something like that. Like, keep your day job, and if you can do that with your eyes closed and not think about it too much, then keep that day job and just do that, and then use all your extra energy to work on your thing on the side, because now you have somebody else funding this and you can kind of self-fund yourself. Um, I think that the investors are available, particularly your friends and family. You may not be able to get like massive valuations even out of your friends and family, but they are still available because they're investing in you, and their time horizon is long enough that they're not really worried about this billion-dollar opportunity in the next 5 years. They're saying, hey, I believe that, Iron Wolf here, or Matt or Mark, can pull something off in the next 5 or 10 years, and I love him. And so I'm going to give him some amount of money. Anyways, like, I'm here. I'm happy to like sit and chat on the side for a few minutes with folks. And all I can say is, like, starting any startup is exceptionally difficult, and starting a VR or AR startup in 2024 is even more so. And so my advice is not that it can't be done or that you shouldn't do it. It's that go in eyes wide open. Don't depend on professional investors. I think there's still reasonable amounts of capital that can be raised from friends and family, small angels that have longer time horizons, and really, really, really lean into professional services. There's a handful of different. Video games are making money. You can make money in that space, even working with other game dev studios. There are consumer companies that invest money into doing experiences in VR. As like a throwaway stupid example, Sephora does a lot of ads on Snapchat and TikTok filters and things like that. And if you can get good at making Snapchat lenses or TikTok filters, that's money, right? That's just money in the bank that you can work on over time. Then business training is probably the best category. Business collaboration, the whole idea of businesses doing their own metaverse, it's not really happening. Like businesses are not making their own metaverses. They're not doing collaboration. They're stuck in Zoom. And I think until the headsets are like 25% of the size and weight of what they are now, you're not going to see any sort of significant transition in the business world to using XR in any meaningful capacity. It's only around training, like some digital twin stuff, but training is it works, it's logical, and people are making money in it, and it makes sense. Like we have some customers who've done some training stuff around, and that's a good use case. So like on professional services, find a little niche that makes sense for you, whether that's doing some backend services, whether that's doing 3D modeling, whether that's working like full blown projects with business clients, working full blown projects as a contract studio with other game dev studios, et cetera, et cetera. And just be mindful. A really good friend of mine and another founder, I won't say who again either, but he spent a lot of time over the last 12 months trying to raise capital from investors without a ton of success. And he's further along than we are and has some good looking stuff and a bunch of cool customers and blah, blah, blah. And I told him, I was like, look, if you just put the same amount of time and effort that you're putting into trying to raise capital from these investors into just doing projects with clients, you'd be further along. Yeah, it takes time. And the investors will tell you not to do it. They'll be like, no, 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 because you need to go all in on the idea. But like, they're not the one grinding day in and day out trying to make the thing work. And so the he came around just recently. He called me and said, I've got some project ideas. Do you guys want to work on them together? And we probably will. We'll probably do some projects together. And it makes sense. It's not that hard to do these projects, and they pay reasonably well.
Thank you very
Cool.
much, Daniel. That
Yeah,
is the official end to the event.
I found it.
That's what I need in this world, just like a little coffee stand. I'm legit thinking about